Okay, 2 points. The first one, and I'll start by one of the first point that was mentioned, multidisciplinary, and I'll share a story with you. I studied in biology here at Ottawa University, and I focused on ecology. And at the time, ecology was quite new, and it was the art of the holistic approach, if you want, okay, where you talk about all the disciplines. And 2 things happened. About maybe 20 years after, I was working at Natural Resources Canada, and I'm visiting the research part where they do research on mining. And they explained to me what they were doing with the tailings. You know, the tailings, the leftover, if you want, after you have extracted the mineral. And I looked at it and I said, hey, this is what we do use in water treatment. And this is something I had studied 20 years before when I was studying in ecology, and that we had visited a water treatment place where you treat water, you know, from sewage to water. It was the exact same principle that was being used. The reasons why I shared that story is because this was seen as a big invention. And wow, we're doing all those things that way. And I thought, my God, if people would have talked to each other before from different disciplines, they could have found and solved the problem of tailings 20 years ago. So that's one of the problems that I see in science. And I was lucky because in my own career, I've worked in multidisciplinary field all the time. Or when they were not, I was pushing for that. And if I have an advice for you as you continue your work or your career, is always try to talk to people from other disciplines, because often that's when you see the solutions that you have not seen before. And try to find, because we talked about communications also, try to find interpreters that to check if what you're talking about, if people will understand. And I'll give an example that we used when I was working at the museum. And because, you know, you have these notions of expertise status. And we were trying to explain to people that every individual was producing 1 ton of CO2 a day. Try to explain what is 1 ton of CO2 a day. So people, you know, we were trying to explain it. So finally the team came up with this huge, I don't even know how to call it, I'll call it a balloon, that was literally what was 1 ton of CO2 a day. And when the team did that, and they explained to people that this was what every human being in Canada was producing a day of CO2, and then people got it. They said, what? Even the staff, they were, each time I was going in front of that, you know, I was more careful with my use of what I was using during the day, because I almost had remorse, because for the first time in my life, I was seeing what was 1 ton of CO2. So I'll stop here. Oh, we still go in the same order? Well, but he speaks longer, eh? You have to watch him. I'll poke him.
Thank you, Denise. Let me say a couple of things. The first thing, I guess, is the theme that Gordon mentioned about the critique of science training. And having been in the business of training students in science for 27 years now, I agree absolutely with this. We do a very, very, very poor job of training students, even in science, let alone in non-science, in the method of science. We focus almost exclusively on the product and not on the process. And this has 2 distinctly unsalutary consequences. The first is that many science students, and as a consequence practicing scientists, do not understand really the limitations of their science. That's problem number one. Problem number two is exactly this theme that I think has already been discussed during the conference, and that is the vast majority of scientists do not understand the extent to which their science is impregnated by normative issues. And in fact, if I can, I've just finished contributing to a manual for Canada's judiciary on the interpretation of scientific evidence in the courtroom. And this is a theme that I explore in excruciating detail because it is critically important for judges who are faced with handing down decisions on issues where science is at the core of the issue, that they actually be able to dissect out those normative elements of scientific evidence versus the non-normative. Of course, they're inextricably linked, but this is something that most scientists actually don't even understand, and it gets them into all sorts of difficulty, and it contributes to something that I think is pervasive, the scientific hubris. I fully subscribe to the view that effective democracies depend on the open and transparent communication of scientific information. The architect of the Constitution of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, noted very, very well. He said that democracy depends on an informed public. And you don't have an informed public, you don't have a functioning democracy. End of story, full stop. And science is the best way that we can inform the public and do it in a legitimate fashion if we acknowledge the limitations of science. There's all sorts of issues to which science fundamentally cannot speak. I'm going to stop there and give the lie to Denise's comment.
Okay. I'll still need help to be told when I should stop. But I guess one of the comments that was suggested from your discussions was that knowing who your audience is, and of course that's always true, but I would want to argue that scientists need to spend more time in the audience, trying to see the world from a different perspective. And scientists, I think, do find that hard to do. Most of the experiences I've had with participatory research programs, usually around agriculture, it somehow turns out to be, despite everybody's good intentions, that the scientists end up looking upon the farmers as cheap labor to help conduct their research. Interesting, anecdotally charming, but they're still cheap labor for someone else's really directed research. And it's very hard to get out of that mold, so I think it's a real struggle to do it. And I sympathize with you having trouble doing it, but there's got to be some ways to work at it. Then I'd like to pose really a specific example of where I find there's a real problem in how to sort out what the role of science is. That's around the issue now with climate change, where you saw in the report that came out September 27th in Stockholm, in the first round of reports from the first working group, where the last bullet talked about the need to understand geoengineering better. Planetary manipulations, how do we adjust the thermostat of the planet? And that's going to appear in the other working groups as well. Working groups 2 and 3 all have big sections in them on geoengineering. And it makes perfect sense. In a sane and reasonable world, we would say, given what our politicians aren't doing, and given the crisis that we are in around climate change, then logically scientists should be looking at a plan B, some way in which scientists can step in a crisis and adjust the planet's thermostat in some way to make sure we survive what's coming at us so quickly. And therefore the research needs to be done now. We need to be ready to move into that unacceptably bad mode, but still one we may have to consider, of taking on the manipulations of planetary systems. Makes sense. David Keith, who used to be at Calgary, is now at Harvard. People like Ken Kildare at Carnegie Mellon and many others are moving very rapidly, and we're seeing now research proposals. And I was in Germany a few days ago, in Germany and Sweden and Belgium in the EU, looking now at how do we scale up our research on geoengineering. That's usually solar radiation management, or it's sometimes a few leftover people think about ocean fertilization as a possibility. Most have given up on that one, but still solar radiation management. Well, again, it makes perfect sense. It's reasonable, except that once the notion is on the table that that geoengineering is a possibility, it enters into a political environment. And all the well-meaning scientists who say we're just trying to do our job because we know the governments aren't, have to realize that what's on the table then is a whole range of options, because there isn't a consensus. I've seen 22 different computer models of what would happen if you use solar radiation management of different kinds. And the politicians are left with a wonderful smorgasbord of things they can do from that range of scientific options. All that's happened from the process of scientific investigation is that the politicians are given a way out. We don't really have to do the hard job, the hard, heavy lifting of social policy and really making changes to our industry or to our societies. We can just pick out the scales and levers and measurements that we want to from the smorgasbord of options, and tell our societies, relax, we've got a solution for you. And solar radiation management is cheap, really quite cheap, in fact. It works, we know that. It's not hard or high tech at all. It's pretty straightforward, and so it can be done, and it gets politicians through the next election. So the moment reasonable scientists lay out these options on the table, they lose complete control of where it goes from there. It immediately becomes an issue strictly of letting the politicians cherry pick whatever solutions they want at whatever price they'd like to, and that can't be controlled. So the idea that scientists might have, that their reasonableness, that their openness to debate and discussion and so on can actually be managed in some way that politicians will pay attention, is simply sweet naivety. That will not happen. Absolutely guaranteed. So the only real issue then for scientists perhaps is to say, we recognize all of this, and the issue on the table is governance. The issue on the table is, how do the nations of the world address this question? How do scientists speak to the nations of the world saying, folks, you got a problem here, and really letting one country go it alone, or creating a new coalition of the willing of a handful of countries who will do geoengineering on behalf of the rest of us, as for example in the Cold War with nuclear testing, where some countries felt very able to speak on behalf of the rest of us and experiment on the behalf of the rest of us. Instead of doing that, scientists have to address the problem here isn't a scientific problem. The problem here is a political problem of global governance. And I don't know how scientists get around to doing that, because all I come across is David and Ken and people like that who are really simply talking about their models and not recognizing that they really won't control the results of their research.
Thank you. I can't resist being close to a microphone, mentioning the analogy to the play that we were exposed to last night on Copenhagen and the Cold War and the nuclear situation.
And the question that Pat Mooney is asking is the social responsibility of scientists also, which is a major question. I think when we're speaking about science and democracy, one of the first things is not to ask to whom we have to speak, but what we have to say, and why we think that we have to say so much, because sometimes to listen to them, it's really better. And it's not just to play with words when I'm saying that. The co-construction of knowledge, it's something very important. And when we're speaking about citizens, we're speaking about people from all the constituency and from different perspective and from different education also. I think it's very, very important. I think also that when we're speaking about sciences, we have to be very clear that we're speaking about all sciences, and we have to include also all knowledge. When we are speaking about all sciences, it's essentially because right now one of the major questions, it's not only the governance, but it's also the framing of the problems everywhere. And I think if there's a role for social sciences and humanities, it's to work at the level of framing the problems and to work with scientists on these issues at this level, not only to be instrumentalized as sociologists, for example, will do a little inquiry after the fact just to add un surplus d'âme, as we say in French. I don't know how to translate that. I leave it to you. So it's important to reframe the debate, and it's also important to work with people. And I was in France 2 weeks ago in a major conference on city and climate change and environmental issues. And it was at the end, we had a major mayors forum with more than 250 mayors in the world. And one of the political power, which is very, very important now on all these issues, it's the cities. And the mayors are playing a very interesting role in all these issues. And frankly, being in an academic context all year, I can tell you that one of the major problem that we have as academic, and I say that to the students all the time because we have students from all the disciplines. It's very not only interdisciplinary, but intersectorial. So we have people from biology to philosophy, and many, many people were on the workforce before. And one of the problems that we face, it's all the education systems tell you that you're the best one, the more brightest, but to do interdisciplinary, we need to say that we don't know. And we have to improve collectively the way that we have to face the problems that are collective problems. And when I was speaking about health problems or, it's just example. We can have tons of examples, but we're facing right now some people who still think that there's a technological fix solution for everything. Doesn't matter what is the technological solution that we will present to the public, that we will force to the public. The democratization of science and technology is not just wording, it's essential. Thank you.